In the vast, blood-soaked tapestry of human history, there is a single statistic that defies all probability. A statistical anomaly so rare, so devastating, that it has occurred only once in 5,000 years of organized warfare. We are accustomed to kings sending their subjects to the slaughter. We are used to generals watching safely from the hilltops while the peasantry drowns in the mud below. But on the 15th of June, in the year 1389, the rules of survival were suspended. On that single day, under the pale, indifferent sun of the Balkans, two supreme monarchs, the heads of two hostile empires, both died. They did not pass peacefully in their beds. They were not claimed by disease or old age. They were butchered within hours of each other on the same patch of grass. Consider the image of absolute power reduced to raw meat. Imagine Sultan Murad I, the architect of the Ottoman expansion, the shadow of God on earth. He sits in his tent, surrounded by the finest silks of the Orient, expecting victory, expecting submission. And then, in the span of a single heartbeat, the fabric of his reality is torn open, not by a lover, but by a hidden blade. History books will tell you about the strategy, about the troop movements, but they often sanitize the visceral horror of the moment. They leave out the smell, the specific, copper scent of a holy man's intestines spilling out onto a gold-threaded Persian prayer rug. It was a moment of taboo violation so profound that it shattered the psychological framework of the medieval world. To kill a king is a crime. To kill a sultan in his own sanctuary while he sits defenseless is an act that tears the fabric of the divine right to rule. There were no winners that day. There were only 25,000 corpses and a legacy of hatred that would burn for another 600 years. This was not just a military engagement. It was a mass ritual of human sacrifice. If you were to stand on that ground today, you would hear them, the birds. The locals call this place Kosovo Polje. In the Serbian tongue, it translates to something poetic and terrible. The field of blackbirds. Legend says they are not ordinary scavengers. They are the reincarnated souls of the fallen, trapped in an eternal cycle of hunger and song, circling the site of their own destruction. But let us strip away the legend and go back to that morning. Before the blood fed the roots of the wild peonies, before the silence was broken by the screams of the dying. The air is thick. It is heavy with humidity and the impending violence of early summer. You can smell the sulfur. It is a new, intrusive smell in Europe. The acrid, stinging scent of the early Ottoman cannons, the crude Bombards that were dragged all the way from Asia Minor to this flat, grassy plain. It mixes with the sour sweat of 40,000 men and the musk of thousands of horses. The ground beneath your feet is hard, dry, waiting to drink. On one side of the field, you see the cross, the forces of the Serbian prince Lazar, a man who has spent his entire night in prayer, accepting a destiny that looks suspiciously like martyrdom. He wears the heavy chainmail of the West, steel links that have already turned hot against the skin in the rising midday sun. His knights check their girths, tightening the leather straps on their saddles. These are men who carry the weight of a dying kingdom on their shoulders. Their shields are painted with the heraldry of houses that will cease to exist by nightfall. The intricate double-headed eagle of the Nemanjić dynasty gleams on their surcoats, a symbol of a golden age that is about to be decapitated. On the other side, the crescent, the unstoppable tide of the Ottoman Empire, a war machine that has swallowed Anatolia and now stands at the fractured gates of Europe. They are disciplined. They are terrifyingly quiet. The Janissaries stand in formation, their distinctive white caps looking like a field of snow in the summer heat, their curved Kilij swords resting ready at their hips. This is the moment before the impact. The moment where time seems to stretch and distort, pulling taut like a bowstring. Every breath is conscious. Every heartbeat is a drum echoing in the ears. You can see the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light that pierce the overcast sky. You can hear the restless stamping of a destrier, the creak of leather, the whispered prayers of men who know they will not see the sunset. The atmosphere is not one of glory. It is one of industrial preparation for death. Across the field, the Ottoman drummers begin a low, rhythmic beat. It is a sound designed to bypass the logical mind and induce panic. A deep, resonant thrumming that vibrates in the ribcage of the enemy. The Meter military bands play not to entertain, but to terrify. They play the sound of inevitable conquest. And amidst this cacophony of preparation, there are smaller, sharper details that ground us in reality. The sound of a whetstone sliding against a blade, sharpening the steel for the work ahead. The scratching of a quill on parchment as a scribe rushes to document the Sultan's final orders, using ink that will soon be indistinguishable from the blood splattered across the page. This is the detailed reality of the Battle of Kosovo in 1389. It is not a painting in a museum. It is dirty. It is loud. It is the friction of steel against steel, and the friction of one civilization grinding against another. The outcome of this day will dictate the map of the modern world. It will plant the seeds of wars that you, the listener, have seen on your own television screens. But right now, there is no future. There is only the field. There is only the waiting. And high above, circling in the gray sky, the blackbirds begin to gather. They know. They always know. And yet, as the birds circle, looking down with their bead-black eyes, they see two very different organisms preparing to collide. On the Serbian side, there is Prince Lazar Hrebeljanović. He is not a young man. The years of holding together a fracturing kingdom have carved deep lines into his face. Lines that catch the dust of the battlefield. He does not wear the arrogant smirk of a conqueror. He wears the heavy, suffocating mantle of a man who has seen the future and found it wanting. Lazar is a relic of an older world. A world of chivalry and feudal oaths that is rapidly being made obsolete by the gunpowder and centralized bureaucracy of the East. He sits upon his horse, a figure of tragic dignity, draped in a surcoat embroidered with silver thread that has begun to fray at the hems. He knows the numbers. He knows the reports from his scouts. But Lazar is driven by a logic that transcends military calculus. In the days leading up to this moment, he has been tormented by a choice, a spectral offer that haunts the Serbian consciousness to this day. The choice between an earthly kingdom, brief and decaying, or a heavenly kingdom, eternal and pure. Looking at him now, checking the buckles of his gauntlets with trembling hands, you realize he has already made his decision. He is not here to win. He is here to die well. Around him gathers a coalition of desperation. It is a patchwork army, stitched together from the remnants of the Balkans. There are Bosnian knights sent by King Tvrtko, riding tall but eyeing their Serbian allies with ancient, ingrained suspicion. There are Albanians, Bulgarians, and Croats, men who speak different dialects but share a common, paralyzing fear of the crescent moon rising in the east. They are brave, undeniably, but their bravery is the wild, frantic courage of a cornered animal. You can see it in the way they grip their lances, knuckles white, jaws set tight enough to crack teeth. They are fighting for their homes, for the small wooden churches in their valleys, for the fields where their children play. It is a personal, intimate motivation. And that is their weakness. They are a collection of individuals, heroes and fathers, but they are not a machine. Across the field, the Ottoman entity waits. It is crucial to understand that Sultan Murad I is not merely a warlord. He is an architect. He is the first Ottoman ruler to take the title of Sultan, elevating himself from a tribal chieftain to the shadow of God. He has spent his life turning the chaotic energy of nomadic raiders into a cold, efficient instrument of statecraft. He does not fight with emotion. He fights with systems. Look at the center of his line. There stand the Janissaries. They are the terrifying innovation of Murad's reign. Christian boys, taken from their families in the Balkans as a blood tax, converted to Islam, and forged into the perfect soldiers. They have no fathers but the Sultan. They have no home but the barracks. They stand in absolute silence, a wall of white caps and blue coats, unmoved by the heat, unmoved by the taunts of the enemy. They are the first standing army in Europe since Rome fell, and they are a terrifying glimpse into the future of warfare. While the Serbian camp hums with the nervous energy of feudal lords arguing over precedence and honor, the Ottoman camp operates with the silence of a slaughterhouse. Murad sits at the center, surrounded by his biological sons and his commanders. He is an old man, perhaps even older than Lazar, but his eyes burn with the cold fire of ambition. He has expanded his empire not just by the sword, but by the ledger. He knows the terrain. He knows the fractured politics of his enemies better than they know themselves. To him, Kosovo is not a holy land. It is a door. It is simply the next geographic obstacle on the road to Vienna, to Rome, to the heart of Christendom. His army is divided with mathematical precision. The troops of Anatolia on the right, the troops of Rumelia on the left, and the elite guard in the center. It is a formation designed to absorb, envelope, and crush. The contrast is painful to witness. It is the clash of the romantic against the pragmatic. Lazar represents the dying breath of the medieval ideal, the belief that personal valor, faith, and the righteousness of one's cause are enough to alter reality. Murad represents the dawn of the modern era, where logistics, discipline, and absolute centralized control dictate the victor. The air between them vibrates with this disparity. A wind picks up, blowing the dust from the Ottoman lines into the faces of the Christian coalition. It carries the smell of exotic spices and the terrifying alien scent of camel dung, triggering a primal anxiety in the Serbian horses. The animals rear and whinny, sensing what their riders try to ignore, that they are standing in the path of a glacier, a force of nature that moves slowly, inexorably, and crushes everything in its path without malice, but without mercy. And in the center of the Serbian line, Lazar closes his eyes, inhaling the dust, perhaps praying for a miracle, or perhaps simply praying for the strength to endure the grinding wheel that is about to roll over him and his people. But the war did not begin with the roar of cannons. It began in silence, the night before, around a wooden table heavy with roasted meats and thick red wine. Imagine the scene inside Prince Lazar's tent on the eve of the apocalypse. The air is thick with smoke from tallow candles, casting long, dancing shadows against the canvas walls. The commanders of the Serbian alliance are gathered for what they suspect is their last meal together. It is a scene straight out of scripture, a Balkan Last Supper, dripping with fatalism and paranoia. The men eat with their daggers stabbed into the table. They drink deep, trying to drown the noise of the Ottoman prayer chants drifting across the valley. And in this pressure cooker of anxiety, the first wound of the Battle of Kosovo is inflicted. Not with a sword, but with a toast. Prince Lazar stands up. He is weary, his eyes bloodshot from sleeplessness. He lifts a golden goblet, the heavy metal cold against his palm, the wine sloshing dangerously near the rim. The conversation dies. The chewing stops. Lazar turns his gaze not to his generals, but to his son-in-law, the finest knight in the kingdom, Miloš Obilić. The tension in the room is sudden and absolute, like a bowstring pulled past its breaking point. There have been whispers, rumors planted by spies, poisons of the mind, suggesting that Miloš has cut a deal with the Sultan to save his own skin. Lazar, in a moment of weakness, or perhaps divine madness, chooses to believe them. He extends the goblet towards Miloš and speaks words that will alter the course of history. "Drink this toast," he says, his voice raspy. "Drink to your health, Miloš. I toast to your valor, but I also toast to your treachery. For tomorrow, they say, you will betray me to the Turks." The silence that follows is louder than any cannon. Imagine the humiliation. To be called a traitor by your own king, your own father-in-law, in front of the peers you are about to die with. The blood drains from Miloš's face. He does not drink. He does not look away. He stands slowly, his chair scraping violently against the dirt floor. He looks at the goblet, then at the king. He does not draw his sword, though every instinct in his warrior's body screams for violence. Instead, he makes a vow, a promise so dark and absolute that it chills the room. "My liege," he replies, his voice trembling with controlled rage, "you are wrong. Tomorrow I will prove my loyalty, not with words, but with a deed so great that the world will never forget it. I will go to the Sultan's tent, and I will kill him like a dog." He storms out into the night, leaving the goblet untouched, leaving the king staring at the empty space where his greatest knight had stood. The die is cast. The script for the tragedy is written. Now, I want you to pause. Step back from the tent. Step back from the battlefield. I want you to look at Miloš Obilić standing alone in the dark, staring at the distant fires of the Ottoman camp. Here is the question that has divided historians for 6 centuries, and now I place it in your hands. Consider his plan: to feign desertion, to kneel before an enemy king pretending to be a traitor, only to strike him down when he is most vulnerable. Is this the ultimate act of heroism? A suicide mission undertaken by a man willing to sacrifice his honor for his people? Or is it a violation of the sacred laws of war? A cowardly act of assassination disguised as strategy? If you were Miloš, standing in the cold wind of that June night, knowing you would never see another sunrise, would you fight with honor and lose? Or would you become a monster to kill a monster? You have 10 seconds to decide the verdict, because when the sun rises, there will be no turning back. While one man wrestled with his conscience in a dark tent, a continent wrestled with its fate. To understand the sheer weight of this moment, you must pull your mind away from the faces of the soldiers and float upwards. Look down at the map of the Balkans in the late 14th century. It is not a unified shield. It is a shattered mosaic, a collection of bickering principalities, fading empires, and feudal lords more interested in fighting each other than the storm gathering on the horizon. For decades, the Ottoman expansion had been a slow, rising tide of green ink spilling across the map, swallowing the decaying remnants of the Byzantine Empire, absorbing Bulgaria, and inching ever closer to the heart of Europe. This was not a sudden invasion. It was a geopolitical suffocation. The Ottoman machine did not just conquer land, it digested it. It turned conquered populations into tax-paying subjects, and their sons into soldiers. By the time they reached the field of Kosovo, they were not just a foreign army, they were a rolling avalanche of history, powered by the momentum of a dozen previous victories. The Serbians knew this. Prince Lazar knew that he was not standing against a mere army, but against a new world order. The Balkans history books are filled with these moments of tragic defiance, but none are as sharp as this. The strategic reality was grim. If Kosovo fell, the door to the Danube was open. If the Danube was crossed, Vienna was next. This was the last line of defense. It was a bottleneck where the frantic, disorganized resistance of Christian Europe finally decided to stand and fight the disciplined, centralized juggernaut of the East. The geography itself seemed to conspire against them. The field of Kosovo is a depression, a natural arena surrounded by mountains, forcing the conflict into a claustrophobic cage where maneuver is limited and slaughter is maximized. It is a place designed by nature for a killing floor. As the geopolitical map solidified into a trap, the night before the battle descended upon the valley. Darkness claimed the field of Kosovo Polje, but it brought no rest. The atmosphere on the night of June 14th is a study in contrasting psychologies. On the Serbian side, the air is filled with the frantic energy of men trying to bargain with God. The priests are busy. There is the murmuring of thousands of confessions, the smell of incense mixing with the smell of unwashed bodies and rusty mail. Wine flows freely, perhaps too freely, as men try to numb the terror of what is coming. They sharpen their swords by firelight, the scraping of whetstones creating a chorus of metallic whispers that drift into the dark. These are men fighting for their soil, and their fear is hot, chaotic, and loud. Across the field, the Ottoman camp is a different world. It is terrifyingly orderly. There is no drunken bravado here. There is only the low, rhythmic chanting of the Quran, a humming vibration that seems to emanate from the earth itself. The Janissaries sleep in shifts, disciplined even in their dreams. But there is a sound here that freezes the blood of the Serbian horses. A guttural, alien groaning. Camels. The Ottomans have brought their baggage trains on the backs of dromedaries, beasts that most Serbian peasants have only heard of in Bible stories. The smell of these animals, musky, pungent, and utterly foreign, drifts across the no-man's land. It sends the Serbian chargers into a panic. The horses rear and kick in the darkness, their eyes rolling white with terror, sensing a predator they do not understand. It is a small detail, a biological incompatibility, but it foreshadows the clash of civilizations that will happen at dawn. The sensory overload of that night is oppressive. It is not just the sights and sounds, it is the temperature. The Balkans in June can be suffocating. The air is heavy with moisture, trapping the smoke from thousands of campfires, creating a smog that stings the eyes. You can imagine the soldiers lying on the hard ground, staring up at the few stars that manage to pierce the haze. A Serbian levy, a farmer pulled from his plow, clutching a spear he barely knows how to use, wondering if his harvest will rot in the field. An Ottoman archer from Anatolia, checking the tension of his composite bow, wondering if he will ever see the dry hills of his home again. They are separated by a few hundred yards of grass and a vast chasm of ideology. But in the dark, breathing the same smoke, waiting for the same sun to rise, they are united by a single, crushing truth. Half of them will be dead by tomorrow evening. The tension is a physical weight, pressing down on the chest, making it hard to breathe. It is the calm before the grinder starts to turn. When the sun finally began to bleed into the eastern sky, it revealed the machinery of death in stark, high-contrast detail. To understand why this day became a slaughterhouse, we must look past the men and examine the metal. This was a collision of two distinct military philosophies, written in steel and iron. On the Serbian side, the philosophy was weight. The heavy cavalry of Prince Lazar were relics of the high medieval age. They were iron towers. A Serbian knight in full kit carried nearly 60 pounds of metal on his body. He wore a hauberk of riveted chainmail, thousands of interlocking steel rings that clinked with every breath, layered over a padded gambeson to absorb the blunt trauma of a mace. On his head, the great bassinet helmet, a claustrophobic steel cage with only a narrow slit for vision, turning his world into a thin, horizontal strip of violence. These men were designed for one thing: the shock charge. They were living projectiles meant to smash through enemy lines by sheer kinetic energy. But there was a flaw. In the suffocating heat of a Balkan June, that armor became an oven. Before a single blow was struck, they were already fighting a battle against exhaustion. Opposing them was the Ottoman philosophy of mobility and precision. The Turkish forces, particularly the Ikinci Light Cavalry and the elite Janissaries, were dressed for the climate and the terrain. They wore lighter mail, reinforced with small, mirror-bright steel plates, allowing them to twist, turn, and strike with terrifying speed. Their primary weapon was not the heavy lance, but the Kilij. This was a curved saber, weighted at the tip, designed to shear through flesh and bone with a drawing cut that a straight European sword could not match. But the true terror of the Ottoman line was not in their hands. It was sitting in the mud in front of them. The Bombards. Historians often overlook this detail, but the Battle of Kosovo was one of the first field battles in Europe to feature gunpowder artillery. These were not the sleek cannons of later centuries. They were crude, bronze monsters cast right there in the camps or dragged on sledges by oxen. They fired balls of stone, not iron. Their accuracy was laughable. At 500 paces, they were lucky to hit a battalion, let alone a man. But their purpose was not sniper fire. It was psychological warfare. When those Bombards fired, they produced a thunderclap that had never been heard in these valleys. It was a sound that defied nature, a roar of hellfire that sent shockwaves through the chest cavities of the Serbian knights and, more importantly, drove their horses into a frenzy. Imagine the panic of a destrier, a horse trained to ignore arrows and swords, suddenly confronted with thunder and smoke erupting from the ground. The Ottoman artillery broke the nerve of the enemy before the lines even touched. As the morning light strengthened, the silence returned. This is the moment that veterans speak of with the most dread: the silence of the dawn watch. The artillery had not yet spoken. The chanting had stopped. The only sound was the wind rippling through the tall grass of the field of Blackbirds. It was a strange, serene interlude. The mist clung low to the ground, a white shroud wrapping around the ankles of the soldiers, hiding the mud that would soon be churned into bloody paste. And there, peeking through the green blades of grass, were the wild peonies. red peonies. Local folklore insists they were white before the battle and only turned red after drinking the blood of the fallen. But on this morning, they were just flowers, indifferent to the political boundaries of empires, swaying gently between the hooves of 40,000 horses. Prince Lazar rode down his line one last time. He did not shout speeches of conquest. He spoke in low tones, blessing his men, his voice cracking with the dryness of thirst. He kissed the cross around his neck, the metal cold against his lips. Across the field, Sultan Murad did the same, his face impassive, his eyes scanning the horizon for the first sign of weakness. The air grew still. The birds stopped singing. It was as if the valley itself was holding its breath, bracing for the impact. And then, without a fanfare, without a dramatic signal, the first order was given. A single arrow arced high into the gray sky, suspended for a moment at the apex of its flight, before plunging down to mark the beginning of the end. The waiting was over. The grinder began to turn. The arrow did not kill anyone. It was merely the conductor's baton dropping, signaling the orchestra of hell to begin its first movement. For a heartbeat, there was a pause, a vacuum where the world seemed to inhale. And then, the earth itself began to scream. It started as a low tremor in the soles of the feet, vibrating up through the legs of the infantry, shaking the water in the leather canteens. The sound of 40,000 hooves drumming against the hard-packed soil of the Kosovo plain. It is a sound that human evolution has programmed us to fear, a rhythmic, thundering bass line that triggers the flight response in the deepest lizard part of the brain. But there was nowhere to run. The Serbian heavy cavalry, the iron fist of Prince Lazar, lowered their lances. These were ashwood poles 12 feet long, tipped with heavy steel points. As the horses accelerated, kicking up clods of dry earth and crushed wildflowers, the knights became missiles. They did not shout. They did not scream. They simply leaned forward, locking themselves into their saddles, becoming one with the kinetic energy of the charge. The impact was not a singular event. It was a continuous, grinding crash that lasted for minutes but felt like hours. Physics took over. When a war horse weighing half a ton, traveling at 30 miles per hour, collides with a wall of human bodies and shields, the result is biological devastation. The front lines of the Ottoman infantry simply disintegrated. Shields shattered into splinters, breastplates buckled like paper. The air was instantly filled with a mist, a pink aerosol of blood and sweat created by the sheer violence of the collision. This is the part of medieval warfare that movies get wrong. They show clean duels, space to swing a sword. The reality of the Kosovo front line was a crush, a claustrophobic, suffocating mosh pit of death, where men were pressed so tightly together they could not lift their arms to strike. They stabbed with daggers, they gouged with thumbs, they bit with teeth. Men died standing up, their bodies held upright by the pressure of the crowd, their feet lifted off the ground by the surge of the mass. And then came the smell. It hit the back of the throat within minutes. It was not just the metallic tang of blood, though that was overwhelming, coating the tongue with the taste of copper. It was the smell of the bowels. In the moment of violent death, the body releases everything. The stench of feces and urine mixed with the sulfuric smoke of the Bombards and the iron smell of spilled intestines. The ground, which had been dry and hard at dawn, began to turn into a slurry. A red mud. Horses lost their footing, slipping on the gore, crushing their riders as they fell. The screams of the animals were worse than the screams of the men, high-pitched, shrieking sounds of confusion and pain that cut through the low roar of the battle. Dust kicked up by the melee mixed with the moisture to coat every living face in a gray-red mask, stripping away identity. There were no longer Serbs or Turks. There were only the living and the dying, thrashing in the dirt. Yet, amidst this carnage, a surprising narrative began to take shape. Against all odds, the heavy iron hammer of the Serbian alliance was working. The sheer weight of Lazar's knights had punched a hole in the Ottoman left flank. The Serbian cavalry, led by the Bosnian commander Vlatko Vuković, was driving deep into the enemy lines, smashing through the lighter Turkish infantry like a plow through soft earth. A wave of panic began to ripple through the Ottoman ranks. You could see it in the way the formations buckled, the way the rear lines began to look over their shoulders. For a brief, intoxicating hour, it looked like the impossible was happening. It looked like the cross was going to break the crescent. From his command post on high ground, Prince Lazar watched the carnage with a rising surge of hope. He saw the Ottoman left wing crumbling. He saw the banner of his ally, Vuković, pushing further and further towards the Sultan's center. The logic of the battlefield seemed to be favoring the old ways. The heavy armor, the lance, the frontal assault. It was overpowering the lighter, more mobile enemy. A cheer went up from the Serbian reserves, a ragged, desperate sound of joy. They believed the miracle had arrived. They believed that God had finally chosen a side. But they were looking at the battle through the narrow slit of a helmet. They could not see what the Sultan saw. Sultan Murad sat on his horse, unmoving, his face a mask of terrifying calm. He was watching his left flank collapse, but he did not panic. He did not send in his reserves to patch the hole. He knew something Lazar did not. He knew that the Serbian heavy cavalry was a weapon with a limited fuel tank. They had spent their energy in that initial devastating charge. Their horses were blowing hard, their flanks heaving with exhaustion. Their lances were broken. They were now stuck in the mud, bogged down in the center of the killing field, surrounded by a sea of infantry. Murad waited. He waited until the Serbian momentum stalled, until the iron wave lost its forward velocity. And then, with a small nod to his commanders, he played his hand. He signaled the center, the Janissaries. They had been standing still this whole time, a white island in a sea of red chaos. Fresh, rested, disciplined. As the Serbian knights struggled to pull their swords from the bodies of the fallen, the Janissaries advanced. They did not run. They marched in lockstep, their silence unnerving amidst the screams. They moved into the gaps, their curved swords rising and falling with the rhythmic precision of a harvesting machine. They aimed not for the armored chests of the knights, but for the horses. They slashed the hamstrings, bringing the beasts down, dumping the heavy metal-clad riders into the bloody mud, where they could be swarmed and finished off with daggers through the visor. The tide turned not with a crash, but with a slow, suffocating inevitability. The trap had snapped shut. The hope that had flared in Lazar's chest began to turn into the cold, heavy stone of realization. The battle was not being won. It was just beginning to rot. But amidst this collapsing world, amidst the mud and the screaming horses, one man decided to stop fighting the battle and start fighting destiny. Miloš Obilić pulled his horse out of the crushing melee. He did not turn back towards the safety of the Serbian rear. He did not look for his king to offer support. Instead, with a calmness that looked terrifyingly like madness, he turned his charger directly towards the heart of the Ottoman line. He reversed his lance, the universal sign of surrender. He threw his shield over his back, exposing his chest, a gesture of ultimate vulnerability. To his fellow knights, watching through the slits of their visors, it looked like the ultimate betrayal. They spat on the ground as he rode past. Traitor, they whispered. Coward. He runs to the Turk to save his neck. The shame of it burned hotter than the sun. He rode alone across the no-man's land, a solitary figure navigating a landscape of corpses. The Ottoman archers tracked him, their bowstrings drawn taut to their ears, waiting for the signal to lose. But they did not fire. They saw the crest on his surcoat, the golden dragon. This was not a common soldier. This was a high lord, a prize of war. Perhaps he carried terms of surrender. Perhaps he carried the keys to the kingdom. They lowered their bows. They let him pass. Imagine the psychological weight of that ride, every hoofbeat taking him further away from his brothers, further into the belly of the beast. His heart must have been hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, yet his face remained a mask of arrogant nobility. He was gambling everything on a single fragile assumption, that the Sultan's curiosity would be stronger than his caution. He reached the perimeter of the Sultan's personal guard. The Janissaries blocked his path, a wall of white caps and suspicious eyes. They grabbed his bridle. They searched him, running rough hands over his armor, checking for a sword, a mace, a crossbow. They found nothing, but they missed the one thing that mattered. They did not check the inside of his left sleeve. There, taped against the sweaty skin of his forearm, was a dagger. A thin, wicked blade, allegedly dipped in scorpion venom, cold and invisible. Miloš looked down at the guards and spoke in perfect Turkish, a language learned during the years of uneasy truce. I am Miloš Obilić, he said. I have a secret that will give the Sultan the world, but I must whisper it in his ear. The guards hesitated. The battle was raging just a few hundred yards away, but here, in the eye of the storm, greed won out. They pulled back the flap of the great imperial tent. They ushered the wolf into the fold. Step inside the tent. The contrast is jarring. Outside, there is the deafening roar of 40,000 men killing each other. Inside, it is muffled, quiet, smelling of rosewater and incense. The light is dim, filtered through layers of expensive red silk. And there, sitting on a low divan, is Murad I, the shadow of God. He is watching the battle reports, his face illuminated by a single oil lamp. He looks up. He sees the Serbian knight, dusty, blood-spattered, kneeling before him. It is a tableau of total submission. The Christian lord bowing to the Muslim conqueror. Murad smiles. It is the smile of a man who believes he has won. He extends his foot. It is the custom. The defeated must kiss the foot of the victor. Miloš crawls forward. He lowers his head. He can smell the leather of the Sultan's boot. He can hear the Sultan's breathing, slow and rhythmic. This is the moment, the singularity. Miloš reaches out as if to embrace the Sultan's foot. But his hand shoots up his sleeve, the friction of skin against steel, the grip on the handle. With a roar that seems to come from the depths of hell, he lunges upwards. He does not stab, he rips. The dagger enters the Sultan's abdomen, just below the ribs. It is a visceral, wet sound. The blade punches through the silk caftan, through the soft flesh, and drags upwards, opening the Sultan from navel to sternum. Time stops. The Sultan's eyes go wide, not with pain, but with absolute, shattering disbelief. He looks down. He sees his own life rushing out. A torrent of dark red blood and gray intestines spills out of him, landing with a wet slap onto the priceless Persian rug beneath them. It is a desecration, a taboo broken. The shadow of God has been gutted like a fish. For a second, there is total silence. The guards are frozen, their minds unable to process the enormity of the crime. And then, the screaming begins. Not the Sultan's. He is already choking on his own blood. But the guards. They descend on Miloš like a pack of rabid dogs. There is no trial. There is no arrest. They hack him to pieces right there on the floor. Swords, axes, daggers. They chop until there is nothing left but a pile of meat and broken armor next to the dying king. Two kings, lying in a pool of mingling blood, while the battle outside rages on, indifferent to the fact that the world has just ended. The death of a sultan is a dangerous secret. In the chaos of medieval warfare, morale is as fragile as glass. If the Janissaries knew their father was dead, the line would break. If the Anatolian levies knew the shadow of God had been extinguished, they would flee back to the mountains. But inside the tent, standing over the disemboweled corpse of his father and the butchered remains of the assassin, stood Bayezid. He was the Sultan's eldest son, but he was nothing like the calculated architect who now lay cooling on the rug. Bayezid was elemental. His men called him Yildirim, the Thunderbolt. Not because he was bright, but because he was sudden, destructive, and struck without warning. He looked at the carnage. He did not weep. He did not waste time on grief. In that tent, reeking of blood and treason, the son died and the emperor was born. He ordered the guards to cover the body. He ordered the silence. And then he stepped out into the blinding light of the afternoon sun to finish what his father had started. The Serbs, still drunk on the euphoria of their initial push, did not see the Thunderbolt coming. They believed the battle was won. They believed the confusion in the Ottoman center was the sign of a retreat. But it was not a retreat. It was a coiling. Bayezid took command of the entire Ottoman army with a ferocity that terrified his own generals. He unleashed the reserves. He threw the fresh Anatolian cavalry into the fray, not with strategy, but with pure, unadulterated rage. The Serbian knights, exhausted, their horses blowing foam, their arms heavy as lead, suddenly found themselves facing a new wave of violence. The momentum shifted instantly. It was physical. You could see the Serbian line buckle, concave, and then snap. The heavy iron wedge that had driven so deep into the Ottoman formation was now swallowed by it. The slaughter that followed was mechanical. The Serbs were surrounded, cut off from retreat, squeezed into a tightening ring of steel. The flower of Balkan nobility was trampled into the mud. Prince Lazar, the man who had chosen the kingdom of heaven, found his earthly kingdom dissolving around him. His horse was killed under him. He fought on foot, swinging his sword until it was notched and dull. But there are limits to heroism. He was swarmed. Rough hands grabbed his surcoat, tearing the silver embroidery. He was dragged down, punched, kicked, and bound with ropes. As they hauled him away towards the Ottoman camp, he must have looked back at the field. He saw his knights dying. He saw the Blackbirds descending to feast on the eyes of his friends. The verdict had been delivered. God had not saved Serbia. But the day held one final dark twist, a twist that would define the soul of the Ottoman Empire for the next 5 centuries. With the battle won and Prince Lazar captured, Bayezid returned to the imperial tent. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold, reptilian logic. He was now the Sultan. But there was a loose end. His younger brother, Yaqub Çelebi. Yaqub was a brave soldier. He had commanded the left wing of the army all day, fighting loyally, holding the line while Bayezid took the glory. He was out there now, somewhere in the smoke, celebrating the victory, unaware that his father was dead, unaware that he was now the greatest threat to the state. Bayezid did not hesitate. He sent a messenger to the left flank. "The Sultan summons you," the messenger said. "He wishes to congratulate you on your valor." It was a lie so smooth it slid off the tongue like oil. Yaqub rode back to the center, his heart likely swelling with pride. He dismounted. He entered the tent, expecting his father's embrace. Instead, he found Bayezid standing in the shadows, and the mute executioners standing behind the flap. They did not use a sword. Royal blood was considered too sacred to spill on the ground. Instead, they used a bowstring, a simple waxed cord used to string a Turkish recurve bow. Yaqub barely had time to scream. The cord was looped around his neck. The executioners pulled. It is a terrible way to die, intimate and slow. You can feel the struggle, the frantic scratching of fingernails against the cord, the bulging of the eyes, the cracking of the windpipe. Bayezid watched. He watched his own brother, the boy he had grown up with, the man he had fought beside just hours ago, turn purple and go limp. This was the primal truth of the new order, the law of fratricide. To preserve the unity of the state, the Sultan must be alone. There can be no rivals, no brothers, no mercy. As the sun finally set behind the mountains of Kosovo, it cast a long shadow over a tent containing 3 bodies: a murdered father, a strangled brother, and an assassin. And standing amidst them was Bayezid, the Thunderbolt, the loneliest man in the world, the master of a graveyard. The tent was now a morgue, but the ritual of blood was not yet complete. There was still one actor left on the stage, one loose thread that Bayezid needed to cut. Prince Lazar was dragged into the imperial pavilion. He was battered, his armor dented, his hands bound with rough hemp rope. He was forced to his knees, not before a living judge, but before the corpse of his enemy. It was a scene of grotesque poetry. The Christian prince kneeling before the dead Muslim sultan, while the new sultan, the Fratricide, watched from the shadows. History does not record the exact words spoken in that tent. Perhaps there were none. Perhaps the silence was heavy enough to crush the lungs. Lazar would have seen the body of Murad, covered in a sheet, and the body of Miloš, hacked into unrecognized meat. He would have realized that his sacrifice and the sacrifice of his knight had achieved the kill, but failed the war. Bayezid did not offer mercy. He did not offer a ransom, which was the custom of the day for high-born prisoners. He needed to send a message to the Balkans that resistance was not just futile, it was fatal. He gave the nod. The executioner stepped forward, his blade gleaming in the lamplight. Lazar did not beg. According to the hagiographies that would be written later, he asked only for a moment to pray. He lowered his head, exposing his neck, the silver chain of his cross hanging down towards the blood-soaked rug. He whispered the prayers of the dying, commending his soul to a god who had seemingly abandoned his kingdom. The sword fell. One clean stroke. The head of the Serbian prince rolled onto the floor, coming to rest near the feet of the dead sultan. In that tent, on that afternoon, the leadership of 2 empires was wiped out. It was a vacuum of power so sudden and so violent that it left the world reeling. But outside the tent, the world did not know the truth. And this brings us to one of the most bitter ironies of the Battle of Kosovo. News travels slowly in the 14th century. and it travels crookedly. As the sun set over the carnage, messengers were already riding hard towards the west, their saddlebags filled with panic and rumor. They carried a story that was only half true. They told the courts of Europe that the Sultan was dead. They told the cardinals in Rome that the Ottoman army had been decapitated. And Europe, desperate for good news, desperate to believe that the Islamic tide had been turned, stopped listening there. They did not wait for the second half of the sentence. They did not wait to hear that the Serbian army was annihilated. In October of 1389, months after the bodies had already begun to rot in the summer heat, the Senate of Florence wrote a letter to the King of Bosnia. It was a letter of congratulation. They praised the happy victory of the Christian arms. In Paris, the bells of Notre Dame were rung in celebration. A Te Deum was sung to thank God for saving Europe. Can you imagine the hollowness of that sound? The heavy bronze bells tolling out a victory that never happened, ringing across a continent that was celebrating a ghost. While the priests in Paris sang, the widows in Serbia were weeping. While the politicians in Florence toasted the triumph, the Ottoman tax collectors were already moving into the Serbian villages, counting the heads of the survivors. The reality was far darker than any defeat. It was a demographic catastrophe. The battle had been a draw in terms of casualties, yes. Both armies had lost thousands. But for the Ottoman Empire, those thousands were easily replaced. They had the vast manpower of Anatolia and the Middle East to draw from. For Serbia, however, those thousands were everyone. The entire governing class, the entire warrior caste, the entire future of the nation had died in a single afternoon. There was no one left to rule. There was no one left to fight. It was a hollow generation. Serbia did not just lose a battle. It lost its biological capacity to exist as a sovereign state. Within months, Lazar's widow, Princess Milica, had no choice but to accept Ottoman suzerainty. She had to send her own daughter, the young Princess Olivera, to the harem of Bayezid, the very man who had beheaded her husband. That is the true cost of Kosovo. A victory celebrated in the West, paid for by the slavery of the East. And what remains of this day? If you travel to Kosovo Polje now, you will find physical evidence of the trauma. The most haunting structure stands right in the middle of the battlefield. It is a small mausoleum known as the Tomb of Murad. It is a modest building, quiet, and shaded by an ancient mulberry tree that is said to have survived the battle itself. Inside, there is a coffin. But the Sultan's body is not there. It was carried back to Bursa. This tomb contains only his internal organs, his heart, his liver, his intestines, the parts that spilled out onto the rug when Miloš struck him. They were buried right where they fell, claiming the land physically and organically. For 600 years, a keeper has watched over this tomb, a family line that has guarded the Sultan's viscera through wars, revolutions, and the collapse of empires. But the most vivid evidence is not made of stone. It is made of petals. Every spring, the field of Kosovo blooms with a specific flower, the Paeonia peregrina, the Kosovo peony. They are intensely red, a deep arterial crimson that looks startlingly like fresh blood against the green grass. The locals will tell you, with absolute conviction, that these flowers did not exist before 1389. They will tell you that they only grow here, on this specific patch of soil, fed by the blood of the heroes who died that day. It is a botanical legend, of course, but when you stand there, in the silence of the plain, looking at that carpet of red flowers waving in the wind, logic becomes harder to hold on to. You can almost smell the iron. You can almost hear the faint, ghostly echo of chainmail jingling, and the cry of the blackbirds, reminding you that the earth remembers everything, even if history chooses to forget. But history does not stay buried in the ground. It has a habit of clawing its way back to the surface, undead and hungry. To understand the true horror of Kosovo, we must perform a temporal jump. We must leave the blood-soaked mud of 1389 and fast forward exactly 600 years. The date is June 28th, 1989. The place is the same field, Gazimeshtan, the site of the battle. But the silence is gone. The birds are gone. Instead, there is a sea of humanity. 1 million Serbs have gathered here, a waving ocean of flags and nationalism, standing under the scorching summer sun to mark the sexcentenary of their defeat. From the sky, a machine descends. It is not a divine chariot, but a helicopter. Out steps Slobodan Milošević. He walks to the podium, erected on the very ground where Prince Lazar's head was severed. He looks out at the crowd, a crowd that has been fed on the milk of the Kosovo myth for generations. He speaks, and his words are not words of peace. They are words of resurrection. 6 centuries later, he booms, his voice amplified by speakers across the valley. We are again in battles and facing battles. They are not armed battles, though such things cannot be excluded. The crowd roars. It is a terrifying sound, a collective release of 600 years of trauma weaponized into aggressive intent. Think about the acoustics of that moment. A medieval massacre being used as the emotional fuel for a modern war. The Battle of Kosovo was no longer history. It was a mandate. Within a few short years of that speech, the Balkans would explode. The ghost of 1389 walked again in Bosnia, in Croatia, and eventually back in Kosovo itself. Men who called themselves the heirs of Lazar slaughtered their neighbors in the name of a battle that happened before the discovery of America. They wore camouflage instead of chainmail, and they carried Kalashnikovs instead of lances, but the script was the same. This is the danger of the story we have just told. When history is not analyzed, when it is worshipped as a holy relic, it becomes a bomb. The field of Kosovo proves that a battle is never truly over, as long as there is someone willing to spill fresh blood to avenge old ghosts. Yet, amidst the roaring of politicians and the thunder of guns, there is a quieter, more melancholy echo that persists. It is the legend of the Kosovo Maiden. It is the final image of the battle, painted not in blood, but in sorrow. The folklore tells us of a young woman who walks the field the morning after the slaughter. She carries a pitcher of water and the loaf of bread. She moves from corpse to corpse, turning over the heavy, stiffening bodies of the knights, wiping the blood from their faces, searching for her fiancé, Milan Toplica, and his 2 blood brothers, Miloš Obilić and Ivan Kosancic. It is an image of profound loneliness. She does not find them alive. She finds only the wreckage of men. She offers water to the dying, listening to their final confessions, acting as a silent witness to the end of her world. The Kosovo Maiden is the avatar of the survivor's guilt. She represents the women left behind, the mothers and wives who have to clean up the mess that empires make. She wanders the field eternally in the Serbian imagination, a symbol of a grief that cannot be comforted. She reminds us that while kings and sultans fight for maps and glory, the true cost of war is paid in the small, intimate tragedies of those who are left to wander the graveyard, looking for a face they will never kiss again. We have walked the field. We have smelled the sulfur and the rot. We have seen the rise of an empire and the extinction of a kingdom. Now, the noise fades. The cannons are rusted. The bones are dust. But the question of Miloš Obilić remains, hanging in the air like smoke. Was he a hero who struck a blow for freedom, or a fanatic who violated the laws of God and man? History refuses to give us a clean answer. It only gives us the consequences. The Ottomans ruled the Balkans for 5 centuries, their power cemented by that act of violence. The Serbs built their identity around the glory of defeat, a heavenly kingdom that could never be taken away because it did not exist on earth. Perhaps the truth is that on the field of Blackbirds, there were no heroes and no villains. There were only victims of a relentless, grinding machine called power. Now, silence the voices. Let the blackbirds return. Listen to them. They are the only ones who know the whole truth, for they have seen it all from the sky. Do not look away from the horror. Do not sanitize the past with the comfort of legends. Your duty is to witness, to look at the blood on the rug, the knife in the sleeve, and the rope around the brother's neck. Look where others turn their eyes. See the fracture points where history breaks and bleeds. Remember the field. Remember the price. This is the BBM Historical Review. We do not just tell stories, we exhume them.